The blizzard came out of nowhere and turned everything into chaos. Snow covered the road, the houses, and even the streetlights, making the entire neighborhood feel trapped inside a silent storm. I was only trying to clear the snow from my car when flashing lights suddenly appeared behind me. Within seconds, 2 police vehicles pulled up, their red and blue lights cutting through the white darkness. I had no idea why they were there. Then I saw Karen standing across the street, pointing straight at me. My heart dropped. I knew instantly who had called them. The officers stepped out into the freezing wind, their boots crunching loudly in the deep snow. One of them walked toward me while the other moved closer to Karen. The storm made it hard to hear anything clearly, but I could already feel the tension building. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong. I hadn't spoken to her all evening. I had barely even looked in her direction. The officer asked me to stay where I was and started asking simple questions. His voice was calm, but serious. Karen, on the other hand, was already raising her voice from the other side of the street. She was talking fast, waving her arms, trying to explain something over the sound of the wind. I couldn't hear everything she was saying, but I caught enough to know she was making it sound like I had caused trouble. The officer with her kept trying to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop. Then they called me over. Standing there between them, in the middle of the storm, felt unreal. Snow kept hitting my face, and the cold made it hard to think clearly. The officer began asking questions again, wanting to hear both sides. I answered honestly, keeping my voice steady. I told him I was just clearing my car, getting ready for the next day, nothing more. Karen interrupted constantly. She spoke louder each time I answered, arguing with the officer, correcting him, even questioning his questions. The more she talked, the more frustrated she sounded. People started turning on their porch lights. Shadows moved behind windows as neighbors watched the scene unfold. The whole street felt tense and uncomfortable. And then, right in the middle of the questioning, Karen said something to the officer that changed the mood completely. The moment Karen raised her voice at the officer, everything shifted. The storm was still raging, snow whipping across the street in thick waves, but suddenly the focus wasn't on me anymore. It was on her. The officer who had been calmly asking questions stopped speaking for a second and looked directly at Karen, surprised by her tone. She kept talking, faster now, almost like she was trying to control the situation. She insisted that I had been acting suspicious, that I was pacing back and forth near her driveway, and that she felt uncomfortable. Her hands moved constantly as she spoke, pointing toward me, then toward the road, then back again. The officer raised his hand gently, asking her to slow down and let him finish his questions. But Karen didn't like that. She began arguing with him, telling him he wasn't listening properly. Her voice cut sharply through the wind, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I stood there quietly, my jacket covered in snow, watching the situation turn into something completely different. I could see the other officer glance over, clearly noticing the tension rising. He walked a few steps closer, ready to step in if needed. The officer turned back to me and asked if I had spoken to Karen at all that night. I shook my head and explained that I had just been trying to clear snow from my car so it wouldn't freeze in place. I told him I hadn't even stepped onto her side of the street. Karen interrupted again, saying I was lying. She spoke loudly, insisting she had seen me moving around and that it made her nervous. But her story kept changing slightly every time she spoke. The officer noticed it too. The wind howled between the houses, and the cold seemed to freeze every moment in place. Snow kept building up on the ground around us. The entire scene felt tense, like something was about to break. The officer calmly asked Karen one simple question. What exactly had I done that made her call the police? She paused, just for a second. That small moment of silence was enough to make everyone notice. The officer waited patiently, giving her time to answer. But when she finally spoke, her explanation sounded uncertain. Then she began arguing again, this time about how long the officers were taking and why they were asking so many questions. And that was the moment the entire situation started to turn in a direction she didn't expect. The wind pushed hard against us as the officer calmly tried to regain control of the conversation. Snow kept falling steadily, covering the ground faster than anyone could clear it. Karen, however, wasn't calming down. Instead, she grew louder, her voice sharp and filled with frustration. "I told you what happened," she said, raising her voice again. "Why are you asking the same questions over and over?" The officer remained patient. He explained that he needed to understand both sides clearly. But Karen didn't like that answer. She stepped closer, still talking, still pointing, still trying to make her version of the story sound urgent. I stayed quiet, answering only when asked. The cold had started to creep into my hands and feet, but the tension in the air made it impossible to focus on anything else. I could see neighbors watching from their windows, porch lights glowing through the falling snow. The second officer stepped forward now, sensing the situation might get more heated. He gently told Karen to lower her voice and let them finish their questions. But instead of calming down, she argued again. She started questioning why they were even listening to me. She said they should trust her because she was the one who called. The officer tried to explain that they had to be fair, that they couldn't assume anything without hearing the full story. That seemed to make her even more upset. Her voice rose higher as she spoke about feeling unsafe, about how she didn't like me being outside during the storm. But the more she talked, the less clear her story sounded. Even from where I stood, I could sense the officers beginning to notice the gaps. One of them asked her again to explain exactly what I had done that felt threatening. She hesitated. Then she gave a different answer than before. This time, she said I was standing too close to her driveway. Earlier, she had said I was pacing. Before that, she said I was watching her house. The officer quietly wrote something down in his notebook. Karen noticed and immediately started questioning what he was writing. She leaned forward, trying to look, asking why he was taking notes. The officer calmly told her it was part of the process. But Karen kept pushing, her voice filled with frustration. And then, right in the middle of the storm, she said something that made the officer's expression change completely. The moment Karen spoke, the officer's calm expression shifted slightly. It wasn't anger, but something closer to concern. She had just accused him of not doing his job properly. Her voice was loud enough to carry through the wind, sharp and defensive, as if she believed she was being treated unfairly. "I called you here for a reason," she said firmly. "You should be focusing on him, not me." The officer stood still for a moment, letting the words settle. Snow gathered on his shoulders and hat, but he didn't react emotionally. Instead, he responded in a steady, controlled voice, explaining that his job was to understand the situation fully, not to take sides. Karen shook her head, clearly frustrated. She began explaining her story again, but this time she spoke even faster, trying to sound more convincing. The problem was, the details didn't match what she had said earlier. One minute she said I was walking toward her driveway. The next, she claimed I had been standing in the road. Then she added that I had been watching her from my yard. The officer quietly listened while writing more notes. The second officer stepped slightly closer, observing both of us carefully. I stayed calm, answering only when asked. I explained again that I had been clearing snow from my car, nothing more. My car was parked right where it always was. I hadn't gone near her property at all. The wind howled through the street, blowing snow across our feet. It felt like the storm itself was part of the tension, pressing everything closer together. Karen suddenly started arguing about something else. She questioned why the officers were standing so close to her driveway, as if that bothered her too. The second officer politely stepped back, trying to avoid making things worse. But Karen didn't stop. She kept talking, questioning, and interrupting. The officer finally raised his hand gently, asking her to let him finish speaking. His voice was still calm, but more firm now. He explained that he needed clear answers, not changing details. For the first time, Karen fell silent. The street grew quiet except for the sound of wind pushing snow across the ground. Even the neighbors watching from their windows seemed still. Then the officer asked her one simple question that made her pause longer than before. The officer's question was simple, but the silence that followed made it feel much heavier than expected. He asked Karen what exact moment made her feel unsafe enough to call the police in the middle of a blizzard. The wind continued to blow snow across the street, but everything else felt still. Karen opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. For the first time since the police arrived, she seemed unsure of what to say. She looked down at the snow, then back at the officer, then quickly glanced in my direction. "Well, he was just standing there," she finally said. The officer nodded slowly, waiting for her to explain more. But nothing else came. He asked again, calmly, if I had said anything to her or made any kind of gesture that made her uncomfortable. Karen shook her head, but then quickly added that she felt watched. That answer seemed to confuse even her. The officer looked at me and asked if I had spoken to her at all that evening. I told him the truth. I hadn't said a single word. I had been focused on clearing snow from my car so I could move it in the morning if needed. Snow kept piling up around our shoes, and the cold air made every breath feel sharp. The second officer stepped over to where my car was parked and looked around with his flashlight. He checked the tire tracks and the snow near the curb. After a moment, he came back and quietly said something to the first officer. They exchanged a brief look, as if they were starting to understand the situation better. Karen noticed and immediately started asking what they were talking about. Her voice grew louder again, almost defensive. She asked why they were looking at my car instead of focusing on her call. The first officer gently explained that they needed to look at everything before making any decisions. Karen crossed her arms, clearly upset. She began arguing again, saying she wouldn't have called if she didn't feel something was wrong. But her voice didn't sound as confident as it had earlier. Then the officer asked her one more question, a question that made her completely freeze. The officer's next question was quiet but direct. He asked Karen if anyone else had seen what she was describing. The wind had slowed slightly, and the snow fell in softer waves now, making the moment feel even more focused. Karen looked around the street as if hoping someone would step forward to support her. Porch lights glowed from nearby houses, and shadows moved behind windows. People were clearly watching, but no one came outside. No one spoke. Karen hesitated. Then she said she didn't know if anyone else had noticed. She claimed she had just felt uncomfortable and acted quickly. The officer nodded slowly, writing something down again. He didn't argue or question her tone. He simply listened. But the silence from the rest of the neighborhood was loud enough to say something on its own. I stood there quietly, snow collecting on my shoulders, feeling the cold settle deeper into my hands. I hadn't done anything wrong, and now it seemed like the truth was slowly becoming clear. The second officer walked back from the side of the street and spoke quietly to his partner. I couldn't hear exactly what he said, but I saw him gesture toward the tire tracks in the area where I had been standing. Karen noticed again. She stepped forward, her voice rising. She asked why they kept looking at the ground and writing things down. The first officer calmly told her they were just making sure they understood everything correctly. But Karen didn't stop. She started questioning why they were taking my side. She said she was the one who called, and they should believe her. The officer remained calm but firm. He explained that they weren't taking sides. They were simply trying to understand what actually happened. That answer didn't satisfy her. She started arguing again, her words coming out faster, her voice louder than before. The storm around us felt quieter now, almost like everything else had stepped back to let the moment unfold. And then, from across the street, a door opened. Footsteps crunched in the snow as someone stepped outside. It was one of the neighbors. And the moment he began walking toward us, Karen's expression changed completely. The neighbor walked slowly through the deep snow, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. The porch light behind him cast a long shadow across the white ground as he made his way toward us. The sound of his boots crunching through the snow was the only thing breaking the silence. Karen noticed him immediately. Her voice stopped mid-sentence, and her shoulders stiffened. She watched him carefully, almost nervously, as he approached the officers. I recognized him right away. He lived directly across from Karen and had probably seen everything from his window. One of the officers turned to greet him, asking if everything was okay. The neighbor nodded and said he just wanted to make sure things were clear. His voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice that didn't carry anger, only honesty. Karen quickly spoke up, saying there was no need for anyone else to get involved. But the officer gently told her it was fine. If someone had seen something, it could help them understand the situation better. The neighbor stood beside us, brushing snow off his sleeves. He looked at me for a second, then at Karen, and finally at the officers. "I've been watching from my window," he said quietly. Karen shifted uncomfortably. The officer asked him if he had noticed anything unusual. The neighbor shook his head. He explained that he had seen me outside clearing snow from my car, just like I said. He added that I hadn't gone near Karen's driveway or said anything to her. The street felt even quieter now as his words settled in the air. Snow continued to fall gently, covering everything in a soft white layer. Karen tried to interrupt, saying he couldn't have seen everything from his house. But the neighbor calmly continued. He said he had a clear view and had been watching for several minutes. He told the officers that nothing seemed threatening or unusual at all. The officers listened carefully. One of them wrote more notes while the other nodded slightly. Karen's face tightened. She crossed her arms again, but this time it felt more like she was protecting herself than trying to argue. The neighbor then added something else. He said Karen had been the one yelling first. And suddenly, the entire situation shifted once again. The moment the neighbor said Karen had been the one yelling first, the entire mood shifted. The wind had almost died down, and the snow was falling more gently now, but the tension in the air felt heavier than before. Karen stood still, her arms folded tightly, her expression changing from frustration to something closer to worry. The officer looked toward her, then back at the neighbor, asking him to explain what he meant. The neighbor spoke calmly, choosing his words carefully. He said he had been near his window when he heard Karen shouting from her porch. At first, he thought she was talking to someone on the phone. But then he saw her pointing toward me, even though I was just clearing snow off my car and minding my own business. Karen tried to interrupt again, but this time her voice wasn't as strong. The officer gently asked her to let him finish. The neighbor continued, saying Karen had seemed upset even before the police arrived. He explained that her voice had been loud enough to hear through the storm. He also mentioned that he never saw me approach her driveway or say anything to her at all. The officer nodded slowly, writing more notes. The second officer looked around the street again, taking in the scene, the snow, and the distance between my car and Karen's house. Everything seemed to match what the neighbor was saying. Karen looked down at the snow, then back at the officers. She opened her mouth to respond but didn't speak right away. For the first time that night, she seemed unsure of what to say next. The street felt still. Even the sound of the wind had faded. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. The officer finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. He explained that they needed to make sure calls like this were based on real concerns, especially during a storm when emergency services might be needed elsewhere. Karen nodded slightly, her expression softening. She didn't argue this time. And just like that, the tension that had filled the street began to slowly fade. But before the officers turned to leave, one of them said something quietly that brought the moment to a final turning point. The officer's final words were calm, but they carried a quiet weight. He gently reminded Karen that calling the police during a storm should only happen when there is a real emergency. His tone wasn't angry or harsh. It was steady and respectful, but clear enough for everyone to understand. Karen stood silently, her arms no longer crossed. The tension that had filled her voice earlier was gone. Snowflakes continued falling softly around us, and the streetlights reflected off the white ground, making everything feel strangely peaceful after all the chaos. The officer then turned to me and thanked me for staying calm and cooperating. I nodded, still feeling the cold in my hands, but also feeling a sense of relief slowly settling in. The entire situation had started with confusion and stress, but now it finally felt like it was coming to an end. The neighbor stepped back toward his driveway, brushing snow from his jacket. Before heading inside, he gave me a small nod, the kind that said everything without needing words. If he hadn't spoken up, the night might have turned out very differently. Karen finally spoke, but this time her voice was low and quiet. She said she had felt nervous because of the storm and reacted too quickly. It wasn't a full apology, but it sounded honest. The anger was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful. The officers gave a final glance around the street, making sure everything was calm. The wind had slowed, and the storm was beginning to pass. With a quick nod, they returned to their vehicles. The red and blue lights flashed one last time before fading into the snowy distance. The street fell silent again. porch lights slowly turned off as neighbors went back inside. The night returned to normal, as if nothing had happened at all. I looked down at my car, still half covered in snow, and finished brushing it off. The cold air felt sharper now, but the tension was gone. That night reminded me how quickly small misunderstandings can grow into something much bigger. But it also showed me something else. When the truth matters, sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who stand up and speak first.
If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments. In the middle of that brutal blizzard, police stopped us both in the freezing street. I stayed calm, but Karen suddenly started arguing with the officers, and what happened next turned the entire night against her. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.